My name is Madeline Kleinfeld. My pronouns are she, her, and I'll be presenting my work on safer and healthier streets for children, the possibilities of street closures near schools in Calgary, Alberta. I recognize that I live, work, and play within the traditional territory of the Treaty 7 people, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta. So I thought I would quickly introduce myself before I get into the bulk of my presentation. As I said, my name is Madeline. I am a Master's of Public Health student in my final semester through the University of Victoria. I do live in Calgary. I have been living here for almost exactly 2 years now, but I only moved from Lethbridge, so I have always been in Southern Alberta. I also completed my undergrad majoring in public health at the University of Lethbridge, so I've been in the academic public health space for quite some time. This work that I'll be presenting today came as a result of my practicum with Sustainable Calgary, where I carried out a literature review on school street closures, as well as a dive into the applicability of these street closures within the Calgary context. So that included a look at relevant policies and such. Aside from my school background, I have a great love for working with kids. I fill my time being around kids through volunteer roles, classroom assisting, as well as teaching dance to littles. All of this has informed my schooling and led to my focus on children's health. That, mixed with my interest in healthy spaces and how the built environment impacts our health, led me to the work I'll be presenting today. So speaking of that, here's a quick agenda. First, I'll give some background info and contextualize healthy, safe streets for kids. Then I'll dig into street closures, what those look like, and the health impacts associated with them. And lastly, I will look at implementation, successes and failures from Canadian models, and then look at how Calgary is situated to support school street closures. So let me just give some background info. As I mentioned, this work was completed with Sustainable Calgary, one of Calgary's biggest advocates for sustainable travel and active neighborhoods. They're involved in all sorts of sustainability projects, but the project that I have been involved with is their Connaught Open Street. So this is a street closure adjacent to the Connaught School that was created in collaboration with the children of the school. The kids brainstormed ideas to make the street more fun, safe, and inviting, and the team at Sustainable Calgary then took the ideas and developed a pilot, which has been on trial. They're now exploring options for a permanent installation. So something that I wanted to quickly point out is the use of positive wording that Sustainable Calgary has used, as they advocate that the open street is an opening of the street to pedestrians rather than just a closing of it to cars. And while I use the closure terminology due to its widespread use in the literature, please keep in mind that these interventions really should be viewed as an opening of the space for use by people. So with the success of the open street, the team wanted to look more closely at other school street closures and get a stronger understanding of the benefits, limitations, and successes associated with school street closures, which is where my work came in. So why do we need safer and healthier streets for kids? Well, motor vehicles are taking over, and that's not a pretty way of saying it, but it's true. In Canada, we have become increasingly reliant on personal motor vehicles, and nowadays, most children in Canada and Calgary specifically are driven to and from school. Importantly, this is not a human fault, but a fault of the system. Our streets and cities continue to be designed for personal vehicles. The work I have been involved with focuses on pushing for people-centric design that makes active travel, like walking and wheeling, the easy choice. So let's look at the health side. Firstly, physical activity is an important aspect of children's overall health, with higher levels of physical activity being associated with better respiratory, metabolic, bone, and muscular health, as well as increased mental and cognitive health. Unfortunately, only 30% of Canadian children are meeting federal guidelines for physical activity, and 41% are meeting active travel guidelines. Additionally, exposure to poor air quality during childhood is associated with a host of poor health outcomes, including respiratory conditions, poor regulation, and poor memory. This is alarming as the typical pollution levels during school pickup and drop-off exceed WHO guidelines. Children's short stature in relation to car exhaust pipes also means that they are disproportionately affected by vehicle-related air pollutants, as you can see in the image here. Now, safety plays a large part in this too. Traffic injuries are the leading cause of death among children in Canada. Every year, approximately 43 child pedestrians are killed and 3,000 seriously injured in Canada. Now, if we bring this image back in, we can see that the child pedestrian is also at increased risk due to the positioning of their vital organs in proportion to the car. On average, collisions involving children occur within 500 meters of schools. And unfortunately, this is unsurprising considering the prominence of unsafe driver behaviors and high traffic volumes near schools. It is important to note, though, that unintentional injuries are preventable. And while we can't eliminate human error, we can create conditions where human error is less possible. So how do we do that? How do we create change? Well, we can educate about safe street use, and this is a great tool, but it does not make streets safer. It only teaches children to deal with unsafe conditions. We can enforce, and changing speed limits is a great example of this. Or we can change the infrastructure or the physical environment. So while my work has focused on the built environment, these other aspects are still important for a holistic view of streets and health. Now, there is evidence to show that child safety issues arising from traffic exposure are most strongly associated with the built environment, which really validates this cause and why this infrastructure angle is so important. So now that we have contextualized the need for safer and healthier streets, let's look at how school street closures can help us achieve them. Starting with what are school street closures? So we can break it down into two different types. First, we have the timed recurring model, which is thought of as the traditional model originating in Italy as far back as 1989. These are often called school streets in the literature. These models have grown in prominence over the last decade, with the pandemic fueling a significant spike in implementation globally. These closures typically operate for 30 to 60 minutes at pickup or drop-off times, and they are typically patrolled by volunteers and enforced through movable barriers and signage. A great feature of this model is that it causes less disruption to residents by allowing vehicle exemptions during operating hours when chaperoned by volunteers. And these traditional school streets have been implemented throughout Canada using this volunteer model. However, international interventions have explored other means of enforcement, like retractable bollards, as you'll see on the top right, swinging gates below that, and automated cameras on the left. So here's just a quick visual representation of the timed recurring prevalence in Canada. Canada's first traditional school street occurred in Ontario. They have done multiple pilots now. British Columbia has also seen a couple traditional models. So has Quebec, and there has been one pilot in Manitoba. Importantly, we must consider that this is only what the literature says about it. There are some that may have not been picked up when I did my literature search due to being in small communities or not publishing their results. So the other type is a long-term closure. These are implemented sporadically around the globe, and while they're much less common than the timed recurring model, they have been cited as a hopeful way forward in reducing volunteer reliance. Long-term closures vary in their implementation, but typically involve the semi-permanent or permanent pedestrianization of a street adjacent to a school. In other words, making them car-free. So this may be done through tactical urbanism or landscape changes. And due to their more permanent infrastructure, vehicle exemptions are much less common among these models. In some cases, long-term closures are initiated following the successful implementation of a timed recurring closure. And while this is mentioned in the literature, details of the process are not well documented. This photo depicts a permanent closure in Paris where they have replaced the pavement and planted greenery. But semi-permanent closures like the current Connaught Open Street in Calgary use things like cement barriers and planters. All right, so let's look at the health impacts of these closures. While most of the current evidence pertains to the timed recurring model, it is inferred that long-term closures bring the same, if not more, benefits due to their permanence. Safer streets are a clear benefit of school street closures. Lower traffic volume is not only objectively associated with less child pedestrian injuries, but subjectively associated with higher safety perception. UK researchers found that streets nearby these closures almost always had a reduction in traffic. Evidence from Ontario pilots also found about a 60% reduction in traffic on nearby streets. By reducing traffic, safety perception also increases. And this hasn't been extensively researched, but at Ontario pilots, there was a 44 to 74% increase in safety perception upon implementation. Which brings me to the next benefit: independent mobility. This refers to a child's freedom to move around and explore their community without adult supervision, providing opportunities to gain confidence, autonomy, and decision-making skills, as well as overall health benefits. The built environment and parental perceptions are key factors in children's ability to engage in independent mobility. School street closure programs are ideal because they can target both. But while independent mobility is consistently cited as a benefit of school street closures, it hasn't been explicitly studied. Now, as I mentioned before, air pollution near schools is well above WHO guidelines at pickup and drop-off times. So the possibility of air quality improvement at school street closures is huge. The largest air quality impact assessment to date involved 18 school street closures throughout the London, UK. The study yielded inconsistent results, finding little to no different at some sites and clear effects at others. The most significant comparison yielded a nitrous oxide reduction of 34%. Reductions in pollutants have also been inferred at Ontario school street closures by comparing the amount of pre- and post-intervention traffic. The researchers cited a 42 to 65% reduction in pollutants during the interventions. This database is limited and could still use further research. School street closures are globally recognized as a way to increase active school travel. They provide an opportunity for children to build healthy habits early on by making active travel the easy choice. According to evaluations, all school street closures in Canada resulted in increased active school travel. The most significant increases were observed during the school street closure interventions, while smaller increases were observed post-intervention. This suggests that children receive more active school travel-related benefits when programs run consistently. However, the completion of a pilot can induce smaller effects. In childhood, social connection is associated with improved behavioral and mental health outcomes. As well, children also benefit when their parents have favorable social connections. So, interventions that provide opportunities for parents and children to connect are ideal in shaping healthy children. The development of school street initiatives requires collaboration and community buy-in, which can strengthen the presence of community connections. They also create a space for members of the school community to gather and connect. Now, formal evidence of community connectedness is limited. However, the parents that were surveyed at the Kingston, Ontario school street closure, about half of them reported meeting other parents for the first time because of the school street closure. Similar trends were also seen at other Ontario sites, but they were not formally surveyed. Further research is needed to properly understand the association between school street closures and social connectedness, especially in children. There is a growing body of evidence that shows that traffic-related noise pollution near schools can negatively impact children's behavior, cognition, and academic performance. Because long-term school street closures reduce traffic at all times, they could lead to an increase in children's performance at school. The association between noise pollution and long-term closures has not been tested formally. However, researchers in Paris cite noise pollution reduction as a basis for their long-term closure model. Long-term closures have the added benefit of providing opportunities to increase green space. This could be done through landscape changes, such as removing sections of pavement to plant greenery, or through a tactical urbanism approach with the addition of plant boxes. These approaches can bring more benefits by reducing the urban heat island effect, thus reducing the impact of extreme heat. This is important because children are more susceptible to heat-related illnesses due to their large body surface area, which results in quicker heat absorption and poor body temperature regulation. So, reducing extreme heat can benefit children's health too. Here are just a couple of visual examples where permanent and semi-permanent street closures can create a cooling effect by reducing heat absorption. So the tearing up of pavement and planting greenery in Paris, and then the addition of plant boxes in Calgary. So luckily, because school street closures have been implemented in Canada, we have an opportunity to learn from them. So let's take a look at some success factors. Community support is essential, as well as collaboration. In one comparison between two Canadian street closures, it was found that the ultimate reason for failure in one and success in the other was due to the presence of strong, clear partnerships among the school principal, municipality, and children. Child participation is also important. When children are involved, there's more compulsion to follow through with implementation. Child participation also provides additional well-being benefits for the children involved, such as gaining an understanding of community development and the social world, self-development, responsibility, and pride. Additionally, in Ontario, it was found that the community was more supportive of school street closure programs when elements of Play Street programming was also in place. Including Play Street elements may lead to a more accepted and ultimately more successful program. Quick sidebar, play streets are specific street closures typically on residential streets where children are given street space to play. This could involve sports like street hockey or chalk, building blocks, really any type of play that you can think of. It is essentially organized, safe street play. All right, so there are some limitations, but solutions do exist as well. Community members often worry that the street closure will result in a shift of traffic to adjacent streets. However, as mentioned, there is not really any evidence to back these concerns. Actually, traffic evaporates when streets are taken away. So quite the opposite. To combat this, program organizers should make an effort to disperse this evidence to the public. Many school street closures have also implemented park and stride schemes to combat traffic displacement. This provides the school community with alternate parking suggestions within about a 5-minute walk to school. Individuals who have extra mobility needs may be disproportionately impacted by street closures due to longer travel distances. Strategies to reduce this effect include the availability of alternate entrances, as well as vehicle exemptions for those with mobility needs, if possible. Now, school street closures that operate on a time schedule are usually reliant on volunteers. And unfortunately, this comes with many limitations. Retaining volunteer capacity is not realistic and unsustainable in the long term. The success of a program cannot override the failure to retain volunteers. This was exemplified in Kingston, Ontario, where a 2-year successful program had to be put on hold because they could not keep up with the volunteer needs. Volunteer reliance also poses equity concerns. School communities with the needed volunteer capacity are often located in higher income areas. And lastly, a sufficient number of volunteers on each shift must be physically fit enough to move the barricades to and from their storage location. To reduce volunteer reliance, alternate strategies could be explored, such as retractable bollards or swinging gates, camera enforcement, or infrastructure changes, including permanent closures and tactical urbanism. All right, so let's just go through a little location checklist. This is largely adapted from EnviroCenter's 2024 report on school streets. It is also informed by a global review on school streets. Programs must not be implemented on important bus or emergency routes without the presence of alternate routes. Alternate parking should also be available at a reasonably close distance. This is where park and stride programs could come into play. Ideally, pre-intervention traffic volumes should be low to medium to safeguard from any traffic displacement. And importantly, those who reside within the school street closure route should be minimally restricted, so not too many driveways. The presence of a school active travel plan also points to a more successful program. The percentage of children living within the route should ideally be more than 50%, and the percentage of children who take the bus should ideally be less than 30%. Lastly, areas where safety issues exist are ideal, so we can use those to back our implementation. Also from the EnviroCenter report is a look into the permitting process for school street closures. In Canada, street closure permits are typically required under municipal bylaws. In some cases, school street closures fit, albeit loosely, under an existing city bylaw. However, this is not always the case, as seen in Kingston, Ontario, where a new bylaw was passed to support the expansion of the program. Firstly, to obtain the required permits, a submission must be made to the city's transportation service outlining the street closure and traffic management plans. And secondly, all school street closures require liability insurance. The liable body differs depending on the leadership structure and typically pertains to the leading organization, whether that be an NGO or municipality. Okay, so this is the last piece to the puzzle of implementation. Pilots are super important for a number of reasons. They are a great tool to gain community support before initiating long-term closures. Pilots provide an opportunity to collect supportive data for the program, which may help support the implementation of long-term programs. Pilots usually see a large change in active traveler rates, so collecting that data is very supportive. Pilots can also generate excitement and educate the community about school street closures. This provides the opportunity for the community to voice their opinions, which could be taken into consideration if and when longer-term programs ensue. Okay, so let's look at implementation in Calgary. So why is this important for Calgary in particular? Well, Calgary is growing. We can see that. In fact, Calgary is one of the fastest growing cities in Canada. So focusing on healthy urbanization is vital. Additionally, Calgary's population is quite young, with nearly 20% of our population being ages 0 to 14. So targeting health interventions at younger populations is a great strategy to improve Calgary's future and overall population health. By bringing together both of these elements, we can highlight the importance of child-focused, health-forward urbanization in Calgary. Calgary also has a great history in travel strategies. And beginning in 2016, the need for school streets to become safer becomes really prevalent. So in 2016, we switched all of our school zones and playground zones into one unified zone that operates for 365 days a year from 7:30 a.m. to 9 p.m. This led to a 33% decrease in pedestrian collisions, and 80% of people surveyed said that fixed times and days were easier to remember. The Active and Safe Routes to School program was then initiated in 2019. This program is a partnership between the city and Everactive Schools, and today 52 schools have school travel plans because of this program. Moving into 2020, we get two updated planning documents, the Municipal Development Plan and the Transportation Plan. These contain policies regarding sustainable travel and pedestrian safety. Then in 2022, we get the 5A network, which focuses on the city's pathway connectivity. And a large portion of their funding has been allocated to infrastructure near schools. As well, we get the neighborhood streets policy, which advocates for children's mobility and fun street environments. And finally, by June of 2024, the city is committed to having in-street crosswalk signs at all schools that include grade 6 and below. I'm not sure how many of you are in Calgary, but anybody that is, you may have seen these around, and personally, I've been seeing them pop up more and more. So this in-street crosswalk sign initiative was following a pilot project at 52 schools that compared curb extensions and in-street signage for increasing pedestrian safety. Both the curb extensions and the signage resulted in a slight vehicle speed reduction. But after further analysis, it was determined that the in-street signage was more consistent at reducing vehicle speeds. Thus, it was chosen for implementation. Interestingly, though, these signs do not significantly change the number of motorists or active travelers, and neither did the curb bump outs, which signifies a need for further interventions targeted at active travel and traffic reduction. School street closures could be a great strategy to fill this gap. Now, an important piece to also consider is funding for school street closures. We have great supportive policies and strategies, but how does our funding capacity measure up to these? Unfortunately, not the best. There's no clear funder for school street closures at present, which is definitely a gap in the implementation. And even though we have great policies and strategies, the funding just doesn't quite align, which makes it hard to bring them to life. There are a couple potential municipal funders that could be explored. First, we have the 5A network, which aims to improve connectivity. And from what I understand, a large portion of their funding is meant to improve infrastructure near schools. And then the Active Safe Routes to School program could be explored as a funding partner. Perhaps school street closures could be integrated within their active travel planning. These are just a couple of potential examples. Now, the last piece that we must consider is the intake and permitting process for school street closures. In this section, I want to be clear that this is purely based on readily available information, along with some input from the Sustainable Calgary team. Experiences with permitting could differ, as it is unfortunately not a cut and dry process at present. While Calgary identifies the importance of community-based initiatives, the current process for initiating both temporary and permanent street closures is a bit fragmented. So a street use permit must be obtained in order to close any city street to traffic. There are a few different ways to obtain a street use permit in Calgary for the purpose of recreation. It is unclear which avenue is preferred by the city for school street closures, but I will quickly touch on a few. Along with street use permits, temporary traffic control plans may be required. These plans must be developed professionally and approved by City Mobility, which kind of takes this process further out of the hands of the community. So the Streets Bylaw 20M88 identifies S parks as street closures for the purpose of recreation. The S Parks bylaw is vague and doesn't offer clear instruction or purpose regarding the decision-making process for permitting S Parks. The bylaw indicates that S Parks are closures spanning extended periods of time. However, a clear time period is not indicated. The City of Calgary website doesn't have a ton of clarity on who can apply for street use permits through this bylaw. It doesn't clearly display S Parks anywhere besides the lengthy streets bylaw document. Another option is through the Play Streets and Block Parties application. These events are community-led and require 2 items. First, a signed petition, including signatures from a significant majority of affected residents. And number 2, a map highlighting the location of the proposed event. The permit application includes key information, including approved traffic control devices and banned activities. These closures are typically on residential streets and likely do not pertain to school street closures. However, the process for obtaining play streets and block party permits could be a good example if school street closures were advocated for in Calgary and an opportunity arose to create a clear permitting system. Calgary also has a community-led Paint the Pavement program where citizens can come together and paint a section of residential street. This encourages placemaking and fosters a sense of community. The application process involves the submission of the proposed location along with a street use permit application, designing the artwork within Paint the Pavement requirements, petitioning residents, obtaining insurance, and completing liability waivers. So this process is quite similar to the play streets and block parties permitting process. However, it is more centered around the act of painting the pavement. So one of my favorite aspects of my final report on this project is the inclusion of case studies throughout. So before I conclude, I just wanted to share a couple of brief, interesting, long-term school street closure examples. So Montreal has a vast network of streets that have been transformed into public spaces called pedestrian streets. Some pedestrian streets are permanent while others operate seasonally. And within this network, there are a variety of child-oriented street spaces nearby schools. Some examples include a street closure with the purpose of giving space back to the children. This space is complete with a bin of accessible toys, which is depicted in the top photo. And then the bottom photo depicts a street closure complete with ramps where children have a space to practice wheeling safely. A few other street closures near schools exist with the goals of promoting relaxation, as well as encouraging safe, accessible travel, active travel, and free play. Now, as part of the mayor's initiative to make Paris more connected and walkable, the Street to School initiative closes school streets through permanent infrastructure. Goals of the program are to make schools safer and air cleaner. As of November 2023, nearly half of elementary and kindergarten schools have a school street. That's 201 in total. And by 2026, the goal is to have 300 school streets. So the Paris model has 2 phases of development, as well as 3 alternative schemes which are implemented when phases 1 and 2 are not applicable. So phase 1, as you'll see on the top photo, also termed undeveloped, this is a permanent road closure that involves pedestrianizing the street through adjustable barriers and street markings. Then phase 2, also termed undeveloped, which you can see on the bottom there, or developed, which you can see on the bottom. The street is re-landscaped with lightly colored asphalt and greenery. The street is also made level with the sidewalk. Barriers are still removable, and the street remains operational for emergency services and waste collection. As mentioned, where phases 1 or 2 are not possible, these are some alternate models that could be implemented. So there's open pedestrian areas, which you can see on the bottom there. These are streets where pedestrians have the right of way, but local services and resident traffic are still allowed. And then the top photo there depicts a meeting area where traffic is limited to 20 kilometers per hour and pedestrians are given priority and simple signage is put up. Timed school street closures are not as common in Paris, but they are implemented on occasion. So, in conclusion, school street closures are a great strategy for improving children's health. Particularly, long-term closures offer a solution that does not rely on volunteers and offers the most benefit. Locations that are able to support long-term closures should, and that's kind of the bottom line. Calgary is largely suited for these interventions, and due to our constant growth in young population, as well as our policies and strategies, and then the major gaps lie within our funding capacity and intake process. If we can improve these elements, Calgary could become home to not just one of the only long-term school streets in Canada, but possibly many of them. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it was informative and interesting. If you are interested in learning more about the project, I would really encourage you to check out my report, which is on the Sustainable Calgary website. The report has tons of case studies and other tidbits throughout that I think are really interesting, so please take a look. There's also more information on the Sustainable Calgary website about the Connaught Open Street if that is of interest. Thank you.